Hello everybody, my name is Valentina Maestra Santa Maria. I am study sociology and literature. We were talking about the young adult literature. He is my guest is Nestor Polo. He is a professor of communication and linguistics in the Pontificia Universidad, Javeriana.
Thank you, Valentina, for having me in your interview.
Thank you. Do you think that the young adult literature is for only young people?
Okay, so one thing that you have to understand is that young adults literature is basically, how could you call it? A sort of classification that the publishing industry created in order to classify certain kinds of books according to reading targets and economic targets in terms of basically the economy, the industry, and all that. And it's very interesting because it's basically under a criteria of selling and publishing. Well, it has a selling and publishing criteria. It's not concerned on or based on aesthetics or thematic classification per se. So the thing is that, for instance, young adult literature can comprehend a wide variety of books, of thematics, that we usually associate with fantasy, science fiction, perhaps romance. We could call them also coming of age stories and stuff like that. And the thing is that if you see them, well, romance is not only for young adults, science fiction either, or any of those, even fantasy. We were talking a little bit before about The Lord of the Rings. That's one of my favorite books, and well, if you track back the story of the trilogy and all the Tolkien universe, well, you see that Tolkien never intended those books for young adults at first, except for the Hobbit, maybe. But so it's more like it was more. He had another intention. So you see, I don't think that this kind of literature is restricted only to young adults. Besides, it's a little bit complicated even to classify for the ages from which you become a young adult until which one, because according to most publishing standards, it would go from 14 to 25 maybe. So you see, it's kind of hard because the topics are very diverse, and when you think that, and when you see and go what people actually consumes in terms of books, well, it's also very diverse. Hey, people from over 30 consumes The Lord of the Rings or Twilight, or 50 Shades of Grey is not a young adults literature because of the topic. Okay, because the topic is, well, bondage is oriented to over an 18 public. Well, there is an intention on the behalf of the author, okay? And the thing is, that I'm telling you, it's not so easy as, because there's no rule that could prohibit someone that it's out of that target, of that consuming population that is kind of specified. There's no prohibition, there's nothing that could prevent anyone else from consuming it. Hey, as I told you, 50 Shades of Grey, and it's very interesting the reaction that you kind of have, because, as I'm telling you, it's not meant for a young adult readership at all. And that is even, hey, remember, the setting, it's called mommy porn. It's oriented to an adult, probably housewives target maybe, But if you see, there's a lot of teenagers that consume it, and there's a lot of adults that do it too. And so in the end, this classification is more in terms of what the industry needs it to be, to have certain criteria in order to sell and create perhaps publishing and marketing strategies, but it's not based on aesthetics or a thematic theme or any other criteria that comes from literature per se. It's from the industry. It's not an aesthetic thing. So there's no prohibition, or the classification wouldn't go on that direction.
Do you think this literature suffers discrimination?
Yes, it does, from different points of view actually, not only academic, I would say. It's embedded on the social discourse, I would say. What happens is that you have to understand that literature, as any other field, like Pierre Bourdieu would say, constitutes a field of knowledge. Okay, so the thing with literature is that since it is a field, it's a field that has been built upon centuries of history of static development, yeah. That, well, along this history, it has developed certain aesthetics, certain discourses around the aesthetics of what a good kind of literature would be. Of course, we have different criteria for this, and we usually associate reading, especially, with learning, okay? And we associate, and if we don't, especially with literature, we associate it with a kind of aesthetic pleasure or enjoyment. What happens with this literature is that it has a different kind of focus. The focus is more on the narrative and not so much on the aesthetics. Not every kind of literature, of course, but plenty of it. And the thing is that it wants the reader to enjoy. It wants to distract. It wants to for the reader to connect with the story. Okay, on certain circles, of course, of I don't know, literature critics, students of literature, we would say, the academia in general, they consider that since this literature is not aimed at producing any kind of aesthetic vanguard or creation or anything, but it's most focused on the story per se, on the narrative, it suffers a disregard. Okay, so it's not how would I put it? It's on social discourse in general and on the academic discourse, and it's not only at the academy, it's also the parents, teachers at schools, because, and that's one of the things too, this kind of literature has been studied, but usually in order to find a kind of a pedagogic tool from it. But very little people has actually focused on what happens behind the enjoyment that may produce this kind of literature. What kind of learning? Yes, but what kind of enjoyment, of pleasure it produces, of practice it produces, and that is the thing. That at least that's what I defend about this kind of literature, is that kids do learn things from it, okay? But most important, kids, young adults, and I include myself among them, in at least when I was considered young adult. We find a kind of pleasure, a kind of enjoyment, and it's vital for us to make us closer to literature, to books, to develop reading habits, because you engage in a practice when it's enjoyable, usually, and that is kind of the potential that I see in this kind of literature. And of that, well, there are plenty of examples.